In the last video, we played around with the GAPI library a little bit more inside the browser console. We saw that we can call that getAuthInstance method, and anytime that we call that, it's going to give us an object back that has a ton of different functions assigned to it that we can use to essentially manipulate the user's authentication status. So now in this video, we're going to continue developing our Google Auth class right here. Let me set up a couple of quick goals for what we're going to try to do. All right. So inside of my auth component, or the Google Auth component, I want to try to get a reference to that auth object after it is initialized. Now when I say auth object right here, I'm talking about how just in the last video we were able to say gapi.auth2.getAuthInstance. When we call that, this is the auth object I'm talking about. So this is the thing that has all those different methods assigned to it that we can use to manipulate the user's authentication status or even figure out if they are currently signed in. So we're going to get a reference to that auth object after we initialize the library. Then after that, we're going to attempt to figure out whether or not the user is currently signed in. Remember, in the last video, we went through the authentication flow. So right now, in theory, we are currently OAuth'd with Google inside of our application. So I want to figure out whether or not the user using our application is signed in. And then once we figure that out, I want to somehow print out that authentication status on the screen. So just a very quick little goal here to make sure that we understand the basics of Google OAuth and how to interact with this library. Remember, for right now, we're not going to worry about Redux at all. I just want to get this component up and running by itself. Okay, so back inside of my code editor, I'm going to find my Google Auth class. So remember, when we loaded up that additional library right here, we had to pass in a callback function that was invoked after this additional module inside the library was successfully loaded up. In a very similar fashion, when we call client.init right here, that executes an asynchronous operation or an asynchronous network request over to Google's API server in order to initialize our client. So we want to get some type of callback function or some type of notice for when that initialization setup is all done. So to do so, we're going to chain on a .then statement right here. All right, let me tell you why we are doing that. When we called load up here, load only allows us to get a signal or a notification of when the loading process is complete by passing in a callback function. But when we call init, we do not have to use a callback function. When we call init, it returns a promise. A promise is an object that will give us a little tap on the shoulder, so to speak, after this client library has been successfully initialized. So by chaining on this .then statement right here and passing in an arrow function, this arrow function is going to be automatically invoked after our library has successfully initialized itself. So inside of here, we can write some amount of code that will be only executed once our entire GAPI library is ready to go. So it's at this point right here that we can start to figure out whether or not the user is currently signed in, and then attempt to print out that status on the screen. So inside of here, I'm going to first begin by getting a reference to that auth object and saving a reference to it on my component class. So I'm going to say this.auth equals window.gapi.auth2.getAuthInstance. So now after running this code right here, inside of any other function inside my class, I can reference this.auth. And that will give me a reference to that auth instance that I can use to sign the user in or sign them out or get the user's current authentication status. Okay, so remember, our goal right now is to somehow figure out whether or not the user is signed in, and then print out that authentication status on the screen. So keep in mind that when this component or this method right here gets called, our component has already been rendered to the screen. So now if we want to essentially update the text or what content this component shows, we need to somehow get the component to re-render. So we're going to be making use of component level state here. After we initialize our library and get access to this auth object, we're going to update our component level state with whether or not the user is currently signed in. When we update that state, it will cause the component to automatically re-render, and we can then print up the authentication status on the screen. So inside of here, after getting a reference to this.auth, I'm going to call this.setState, and I'm going to pass in an object here and say is signed in, and that's going to be the result of calling this.auth.isSignedIn.get, like so. Okay, so now after loading the library, after initializing it, We finally get our reference to the auth library itself, or the auth object, and then we're going to update our component level state with this new property called isSignedIn, and we're just going to take that directly off of that auth object. Now, isSignedIn right here, if you want to, you can flip back over to the Google API documentation and see that this is a property on that auth object. And if we want to get whether or not the user is currently signed in, we just reference that get function, or we invoke it like so. Okay, so now that we are making use of component level state, we need to make sure that we initialize the state object when our component class is created. So at the top of this class, I'm going to say state is signed in, and I'm going to default that to have a value of null. The reason I'm putting null right here is that we do not know if the user is signed in or not signed in when our application first loads. So if there is a value of null for is signed in, that means that we do not know if the user is signed in or not signed in, and so we probably should not print anything on the screen at that point in time. Okay, so now, inside my render method, I could put some logic directly inside of here to look at the value of this.state.isSignedIn and then print out either yes, no, they are signed in. But instead, I'm going to make a little helper method just to help us kind of print out the appropriate text. So I'm going to make a helper method called renderAuthButton. Right now, we're just going to be returning some div with text in it, but as you might guess, in just a moment, we're going to replace this with some actual button logic or some button to show up on the screen. Okay, so inside of here, I'll say if this.state.isSignedIn equals null, then I'm going to return a div that says, I don't know if we are signed in. And then else, if this.state.isSignedIn, we could say equals true, but we don't actually have to say equals true. We can just reference the property by itself and it would be the same thing. Now, if we are signed in, then I'm going to return a div that says I am signed in. And then finally, we'll handle the last case, the case in which I am not signed in and isSignedIn is equal to value of false. And so in this case, I will return a div that says I am not signed in, like so. And then finally, down inside my render method, I'm going to reference that helper method we just put together. So I will call this.renderAuthButton. Okay, now I'm going to save this and we'll flip back over the browser and test this out. So I'm going to flip back over. And I see at the top right-hand side, it says I am signed in. So that means we are currently signed in. Now, just to make this a little bit more interesting, let's try actually signing out. Right now, we don't have a button to sign our user out, but we can very easily sign out by using our console and directly manipulating the GAPI library. So I can say gapi.auth2.getAuthInstance. So remember, that's going to get us access to the auth object. And then one of the methods on that object is sign out right there. So I'm going to say gapi auth2.getAuthInstance.sign out. And then once I call that, I am no longer considered to be signed in via Google OAuth. So I can now refresh the page, and when I do so, I should see I am not signed in print up inside my header. So I'll refresh the page. You see that it said there very briefly, it said, I don't know if I'm signed in. That was while the GAPI library was loading up and trying to decide whether or not our user was signed in. And then once it determined that the user was not signed in, we called setState, and we now see I am not signed in. So now if we want to, we can sign in one more time by doing gapi auth2.getInstance sign in. That will kick us through the OAuth flow again. So I'm going to select an account right here. And then we get kicked back over to our page. Now, we don't have any logic inside of our application right now to get a callback or some type of notification when the user does sign in. So if we want to see that header text update, we have to actually refresh the page. So I'll do so right now, and you'll see that it now goes back to saying I am signed in. Now, the really nice thing about this Google API library is that it's going to hold your authentication status between refreshes of the page. So for example, if I refresh right now, you'll see that I am still signed in, and I can refresh as much as I want, and I'm still going to be signed in until I actually sign out. Okay, so that's pretty much the basics of this library in a nutshell. Now, it would be really nice if we made sure that whenever the user actually signs in, we dynamically, like on the fly, change the text right here. So let's try to take a shot at that in the next section. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.